Welcome to Desert Wanderers, produced by Salt and Light Radio. If you're new here, we bridge the gap between you and the person in the pew next to you. I will be interviewing priests, religious, and laity in our local Boise diocese, asking questions that'll help you navigate your vocation and help build community wherever you are with whatever resources you may have. Let's build the city of God together. Doug, I'm so excited to have you on today.
It's nice to be here.
We are going to be talking about Catholic social teaching. So if you would just go ahead and just give us a little bit of your background
Sure.
and what you've kind of been doing recently.
Well, my name is Doug Ollis. I am the now retired former executive director for Catholic Charities of Idaho. I was kind of a lifer in Catholic Charities. That's not quite true. But I started in 1985 for Catholic Charities of Portland, and I was 19 years in Portland and then 10 years here. So 29 years in Catholic Charities.
So did you have your family in Portland and then move here?
Yes, right. We raised our family mostly in Portland. I have 7 children, so the tail of the family got quite a bit of time in Idaho, but most of the kids were adults when we moved here. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So in terms of even our topic today, Catholic social teaching, my practical understanding or knowledge or engagement with Catholic social teachings comes from my professional work, because the Catholic Charities is an apostolate of the Church that's created by the local bishop to fulfill an interest of the Church, and that is, the gospel mandate of service, and it's sort of a bridge of church to world ministry. So, and I was mostly in management in my time at Catholic Charities. So it was always the task of trying to, discern the signs of the times, the community that you're in, and what does that mean in light of the gospel? Mm-hmm. And that's right out of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, that the church has a task to discern the signs of the time in light of the gospel. So I suppose I have a practical approach to Catholic social teaching, in the sense that there's all the principles, and I've done a lot of presentations on the 7 principles or the 10 principles, or however you count these things. But in some ways, I think, that there's value in that. There's also risks in abstracting it too much. Mm. So, I've been thinking a lot about what is this element of the Church's doctrine. It's the insights that the Church brings relative to the time that we live in. And we're going through a very chaotic period right now. Yeah. And that's distressful, and it certainly affects the things that, say, an organization like Catholic Charities would try to address. Things like housing, basic needs, family instability, protection of the vulnerable, migration, really topical issue. Mm-hmm. Mental health crisis is an enormous issue. And those are direct presenting issues. But why? Why are those issues the issues they are? And what's upstream from those presenting issues? And that's an area that's of interest to me. And I think then sometimes you have to understand what's the challenge we're facing, and then you can come back and look at the Church's tradition and maybe better understand it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the way I've been approaching this topic in the last few years, because I think the last 4 years or 5 years have been extremely challenging. One of my favorite questions for people is, what do you think's going on? Or can you explain what's happening? So that there's a distress in that, but it's also an enormously creative and interesting time for that reason. And I think from this perspective of faith, it's also interesting because it awakens, maybe deeper issues that we took for granted before, that we have to rediscover. And I think that's really true about the social doctrine of the church.
Yeah. So we had Jason Everett on a couple months ago.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things that I love that he said, it was like the very beginning of the episode, he was saying, a lot of people think that the problem of us having to define what a woman is or what a man is such a big issue, and that it's like this crisis in our time.
Yeah.
He's like, but what an opportunity us in the church to like take this time to like really dig into like what did God create you to be?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, Mary McCarthy, who teaches at John Paul II Institute, says about all of these kinds of issues, it's so bad, it's good.
Yeah.
Because it really brings and it's maybe something I'll want to explore here a little bit before we get maybe into a more specific discussion about principles. What is it that we could say about what's happening? And there is a kind of flow to the culture that you and I live in. It's moving us in a direction. What is that direction? And as these new issues emerge, like say gender identity is such a great topic because it reveals a lot about a path that we may have been on for a long time but couldn't really see. And what do we make of that? And then what is it in light of the gospel and our tradition we can say about that?
Yeah.
And that really is part of what Catholic Church or what Catholic social teaching is for each of us. It's a vehicle, or to use a phrase that Charles Piguet uses, a portal for understanding our discipleship.
Yeah.
So it's another way of living out your Christian faith.
Okay, I'm so excited to talk about this more, but let's go back. I just want to go back to kind of your vocation for a second.
Yeah.
So like there's big V vocations, which is like marriage, priesthood, religious life, those kinds of things. And then I think there's little V vocations, which are still just as important, which might be like what job you do or what kind of mission are you doing in the church and this kind of stuff. So my question to you would be, how did you first get into this sphere of Catholic social teaching in terms of, okay, so we said that it was started in Portland at Catholic Charities, right? So what was your degree leading up to that? Was there like a calling on your heart through college or even before that like kind of pushed you in that way, or is it something you fell into that you really just kind of clung to, and it's become more of a vocation? So let's just start with that.
Wow. Okay.
I know, but that's like a 20-minute answer there.
I think everyone has to think about a question like that. Probably a little more the latter. I wouldn't say it's completely a falling into it accidentally. I met my wife and I went to Willamette University in Salem in the late 70s and up to early 80s. And we had a basic, good, solid liberal arts education, which was a great education for, sort of preparing yourself to understand how do I live in the world that I'm in. Not a Christian background. I was raised with... in a family that really didn't have a religious practice. My parents had religion upstream in their families, but by the time they formed a family, they weren't practicing. So I grew up. I tell people I was a typical Portlander, even in the '60s. Growing up, most of the families on our street didn't have religion; they didn't do religion.
Right.
So I came to faith in the last years in college, and then really. And the early 80s were sort of it was economically unstable time, and I was trying to discern it. And if you come to faith, suddenly your calculations on what you might want to do or what's important to you sort of change radically. So I was on a path to maybe do some kind of public service, maybe in the area of urban planning or something. But then I became a Christian. We were initially Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and we came into the Roman Church. And so that was really, the primary vocation is discipleship, ultimately, life in God, and so trying to understand what that might mean in terms of a career. So really worked through, based on the degree I had, I went into social services of some kind, and I worked in the Department of Labor program in Portland, just, providing vocational training services for people.
I have a quick question really quick.
Yeah.
So did you say that your wife, I might have missed this, did you say that your wife was also non-practicing at that time?
No, she was raised Protestant. She was raised conservative Baptist.
Okay, so then my question goes in. I think there is a large amount of people today that the Eastern Orthodox, they're having a good presence on social media.
Yeah, they sure are. I see that.
And so there's a lot of people that are actually converting to Eastern Orthodox or, just any one of the other denominations or denominations of Eastern religion.
Right.
Anyways.
Right.
But what I guess what I was asking is, how did you guys get to that, and then why did you decide to become Roman Catholic after Eastern Orthodox, and how did your wife feel about all this? Because Protestantism is way different than even Roman Catholicism, and then Eastern Orthodoxy is
it's pretty exotic.
Yeah,
and it was actually in the early 80s even more exotic than it is today.
Really?
Yeah, I think just because there's so many ways through our communication platforms to find different things. We didn't have social media. You had the phone book. And the library. You couldn't go online and look up stuff.
Right.
Or say, I like Catholicism. Is there something like it? Or something like that,
Right.
So I think, the short answer is grace, right? Okay. So God's initiate. God is always the initiator. So I think coming into faith, to life in God, you start to. It's like I describe it as like the closet in Narnia, right? Yeah. It's not having any religious practice. It was like opening the wardrobe, and suddenly like going to. And I just instinctively knew from my background in romantic poetry and other that I wasn't really interested in the Protestant confessions in various forms. There was something about a sense of transcendent, something that's more rooted in ritual. Not even like Lutheran or... Jen and I went to a kind of a high church Anglican parish for a while. Okay. And that was great. And it was a nice introduction to kind of Christian liturgy. But there's a sense, at least in the Western church, that the default setting for all of that is the Roman church. So going to liturgy and whatnot, like I said, it was like Narnia. It was just magical and different, completely foreign. But there's so much to learn then. It's an area that you've never had exposure to. So just in following maybe the Holy Spirit, and I'm probably a little more intellectual in the way I process things. So I started reading, and I think, I certainly believe that the diversion into Eastern Orthodoxy was really important for us. And I think just this sense of maybe a little more pre-modern liturgical expression was appealing. Maybe instinctually, I had a sense that there isn't something about the modern operation isn't quite working for us very well. Mm-hmm. And not to say that the contemporary Roman Catholic liturgical expression isn't expressive of ways to fulfill your discipleship in that, but it is more contemporary. Yeah. So I think it was probably initially just a sense of interest in learning more about Christian liturgy, because that's the poetry of our life, right? And liturgy is poetic, and so we were coming to Portland from Salem one day, and I looked up in the yellow pages of an old phone book, an Orthodox church, and so we went to liturgy there, and I think that was so magical. And it was cosmological. It was like so different. Lots of incense and constant chant and motion. I know a recent convert to Orthodoxy, an English writer that I really like, said it was like going into a Christian dream. Yeah. And he said, I don't even understand. He became Orthodox after that, but he said, I don't even understand most of it, but that doesn't matter. I don't need, that'll come. I'm not worried about learning the doctrine. Because in liturgy is really about experiencing a reality, and I think that was our sense of that, and it was also kind of different. It was really different. No one in any family had ever heard of this before. So that was great, and I think that was really helpful for Jennifer. And you should have her on to talk about her. But
this would be a great conversation.
For her, it was helpful because she, as a Baptist, she had a lot of indoctrination about the problems of the Roman Church. Yeah. So obviously, Mary, a lot of hocus pocus, and a lot of the whole issue with the saints, and it's the default normal stuff, and. Here was something that wasn't Roman Catholic, but it held by intention and directly all that. This has been around a long time. Mm-hmm. And it had all of those things. Now, it didn't have exactly the issues of church authority around the Pope. That was a piece that wasn't there. But it bridged a lot of these other areas in a way that you could enter it and not, without triggering your anti-Roman bias,
That's actually a really beautiful point. And I think the one thing about if I'm correct on this, they have the same stance on Mary, but it's not a doctrine per se like it is in the Roman Catholic Church. They call her the Theotokos, and
right.
They have this like teaching, but it's not like a dogma like it is in the Roman Catholic Church. They're a little more flexible, aren't they, on the teaching? That's been my understanding.
Right.
But I don't,
Yeah. So we're recording on a Marian feast today.
Yes.
And so, they wouldn't. Their theological frame is largely patristic in the Church Fathers, so they have a lot of specificity in that regard, but they're not as detailed in terms of you'll read liturgically that Mary is the sinless one or the spotless one. So you see a lot of that, holding that tradition, but the language of precision that we have in the Roman Church, the Immaculate Conception, some of that uses scholastic theology that's foreign to them. And then the Assumption is the other Marian doctrine, which they call the Dormition, the falling asleep of Our Lady. I'm not trained enough to explain the nuances of the differences, but in a practical devotional sense, I think most Orthodox Christians and most Roman Catholics would be hard pressed to note that they have a great love for the Virgin Mary. Yeah. So she's permeates all of their liturgical services. She shows up a lot. So
I have our neighbor next door to us in our first apartment. He was Coptic.
Oh, okay, that's another Eastern church,
he was not he's Coptic, not connected to the Roman, because there's the Coptics that are connected, and then there's the Coptics that aren't.
Well, that's the true of the Byzantine Catholic versus Orthodox. We have
right. So exactly. So, anyways, it's been really interesting to see how similar we are, yet
in some ways how different.
Yeah. But I also like what I like about looking at those different churches, like is just when you talked about like the magic, like going into a dream, it's like when you enter into those buildings, there's so much mystery. And I think that I have heard, and I'm not an expert by any means on the Orthodox Church, but they've really tried to engage that mystery, and they're okay with not knowing, whereas the Catholic Church has really like tried to provide answers to people if they wanted to search for them.
Right.
And I think that that's something that, in a way, we've explained so much stuff that you kind of lose the mystery and like the miracles almost.
We have a tendency in the Western Church to narrate a lot, and without resisting that history, sometimes you feel like maybe we do over narrate, maybe, but at the same time, though, I think the beauty, and I've said this on like every single podcast I've ever said, but it's like the beauty of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is there's something for everyone. Yeah. If you're really intellectual, wonderful. Absolutely. If you're a mystic, there's a place for you. Yeah. So in that point, I would say that. Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I think that was part of the attraction. I have some reflections a little bit on how all of this relates to the contemporary situation, but what the Eastern Church lacked, I think, and Jennifer and I were young when we were building a family, a marriage, we had a baby coming. There isn't a lot of developed teaching and culture, a clarity of culture around the family. There's certainly a lot more reflection that the Catholic Church has provided to families, I think. And so I think that was an attraction.
Were you just talking about like a defense of the family, like a protection? Or
no, a way of being as family.
Yeah.
I mean, I think ultimately that's the task of discipleship, is how am I to be, right?
Yeah.
So in this regard, you're confronted with all these modern technologies, the development of biomedical technology around contraception. What do we do with that? And a church that's rooted in the Church Fathers, which is wonderful, may not have an answer that is clear, whereas the Catholic Church provided a lot of clarity.
Right.
So, and then as you moved in, this was John Paul II's great area pastoral interest, the family. So I think Familiaris Consortio had just been issued in 81. So, it's like, wow, this guy, he's rocking this issue. And then this was also in the post-conciliar era, and this gets into a little bit schools of theology in the Catholic Church, but the sort of Ressourcement school, the Communio school, the Ratzinger, de Lubac, von Balthasar school, they were all about re-engaging the church with the great tradition, re-engaging with the church fathers, so they were a kind of bridge to the Eastern Church. So it was kind of like you could see this vitality in the Roman Church, and drawing on the patristic tradition, not to the exclusion of the scholastic tradition, but so that was itself a bridge, and yet it offered a lot of other of these teachings that were more contemporary. So I think all of those things, but you always have to step back and say, there's grace, there's mystery in this, and just there isn't always a full intellectual explanation for how we move into God, I think.
So at this point, then, going back into your story and how you've come into this place to really take on a lot of knowledge when it comes to Catholic social teaching, at this point, when you were coming into the Roman Catholic Church, were you already working for Catholic Charities, or did this happen?
No, that happened about 10 years after. So so this is we came in 84. So it was 11 years.
To the Roman Church?
Yes, right.
Okay.
So it was 11 years. And then there was just an opportunity, an opening for basically the deputy director position. And I think it was just the opportunity to move out of, sort of the secular area of service into a better integration of faith and work. So that, it was pretty practical in a way.
Yeah.
And so that's really what brought me there.
Okay. So then at this point, you have been a Catholic for 10 years, going into Catholic social teaching. How much had you been studying in that regard before taking the position, or how much did you know, I guess, kind of leading into that?
I don't, in terms of knowledge of, just off the top of my head, identifying principles, I'm not sure, that I was aware of it. You would encounter it in articles. And John Paul II is, again, he was so prolific and active, and these were topics. His encyclicals on economic forces and the family. All of these are social issues, right? But I guess it wasn't something that I had tried to put together in a uniform way, which the church kind of does in these principles. So it was there, but I think it was when I was stepped into a leadership role, and then I'm working in a very secular community in Portland, and most of our staff were not Catholic, and many not even Christian or churchgoers. So then you have to try to explain the tradition, because and in a language that a non-believer can understand. So sometimes you have to really step back and what's a way of articulating this?
So being that it is a nonprofit, are there different rules on bringing religion into the workplace? Or how does that work? Because if you have non-religious people, did you have working at a Catholic organization?
Yeah.
Was there the expectation for them of like, this is the kind of, like, if you're a therapist, you have to kind of follow these guidelines on how we're going to administer.
Right. That's a great question, and slightly complicated.
Yeah.
So depending on the service or ministry, you could say these are values and principles that are non-negotiable. I don't care what your background is. If you were engaged in a formal ministry, like we had a ministry to people who had HIV disease for many years, and that was explicitly a ministry. You had to be Roman Catholic to do that.
Oh, okay.
Or we had a perisocial ministry position where people would go out and teach about Catholic social teaching. You had to be Catholic to do that.
Yeah.
So there were instances where that was a requirement. Other instances, it's not a requirement, but you have to know who we are from a value perspective, and you have to be comfortable working here. And that's always, kind of the final question in the interview is, this is the background of the church. Sometimes you would explicitly touch on particular issues you knew were going to be a challenge.
Right.
Issues like contraception. We don't dispense contraceptive materials.
Yeah.
We don't facilitate or help in any way a woman who's abortion-minded. Can't materially cooperate. So you have to get those on the table.
I feel like that would be kind of hard to
yeah.
enforce in a way too if someone didn't want to.
Well, they say they're comfortable. They have to say that. They have to address that question. There were instances where that was a problem and we had to deal with it. I will say, and this is, maybe this is where I'm at now. I think that some ways it's hard, and this is just my particular opinion, but I think it can be hard to institutionalize something like Catholic social teaching per se. I think because in some ways, as I've tried to contextualize this, it's rooted in conversion. It's rooted in relationship with God. It requires a transformation, and if you don't have that, you can get in your own way. You can be doing it for the wrong reasons. Even just saying, well, we're Catholic and we hold these values, but sometimes that isn't enough. It requires, ultimately maybe a little bit of distance from the work itself. It's not my work.
Yeah.
It's a ministry of the church. It's the ministry of Jesus, and so that's probably an area that I, over the years, would struggle more with. And also as the culture moved more radically away from the values of the church, it became more of a challenge. So I think it remains a challenge today for anyone in institutional leadership, especially in institutions that are bridged from church to world, where you're placed in the world intentionally.
Yeah.
Christ requires that we go into the world. But I think from an institutional perspective, I think it can be very challenging.
Well, I was just thinking what came to mind when you were speaking was, I've mentioned this on a previous podcast, but I was listening to a debate between someone that was anti-abortion versus pro-abortion. Mm-hmm. And what I understood for the first time is I've been so tuned out of that conversation, one-sided, just super one-sided, that for the first time I didn't see them as a villain. And because the part of it is, and I think this is the same thing on probably anything in Catholic social teaching, is it's not that the other person is a villain or that they're choosing evil, right? It's the same thing. My husband works in immigration, and it's the same thing with him. It's just if we actually listen to the argument from a human perspective, you can see that there's a human aspect that we're missing if we don't engage with that problem. It's almost like, for example, in her argument, she was a medical student who was pro-abortion. And one of the things she was just talking about, the challenges that women face when they don't have husbands. It's hard, to chase people for child support around the world, around the country and all this other stuff, and how it's not good for XYZ reasons, right? And she was really focused on the good of the woman, which, for so long I thought was so selfish and so ridiculous, just, whatever. Yeah. But when I heard her, it was the first time I could actually hear her say, I see something lacking, and this is something that is a good. We should fight for this good, but we're doing it in the wrong way. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So I think that there's, not only is there the evangelization of the person that is needing to receive those things, but there's also the person that, if you have this view, if we're just taught Catholic social teaching without having the transformation of our heart, then it's just going to be a battleground, right? Right. So
I think also just being interested in why people believe what they do, and it's that let's go upstream. I get where we're fighting over this. Leila Bresco is really good on this topic. That's one of her ministries, is getting this dialogue on abortion, and it's very fascinating.
Is she Canadian?
I think she's American.
Oh,
she's a convert. I don't know if you know, but anyway. So I think getting people to, what is it that makes you see it that way, if it's about the life issue, or, so we get locked sometimes in, Christianity is subversive of any system that and I think we can get attached to a structure that's the solution, this structure, this political position. And I think the church we always have to, as disciples, know that no system is going to, there's no perfect system. And we always have to, what are we missing, or what are we overcorrecting for, or what are we not able to see that we need to see? That's the crisis of our time, or is like, it can be gift to us. And so sometimes stepping into those conversations is unpleasant, because you have to override and I've been reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, about left hemisphere, right hemisphere work. And we get locked in our left hemisphere, which is all about the detail. It holds the facts, and we're ready to go to war on that, and we need to kick into the right hemisphere a little bit, which I kind of call the Catholic hemisphere, in the sense that it's the more universal, the relational. Not that we're wrong about the sanctity of life, we know that, but the ability and capacity to engage people isn't.
Well, and again, it takes both, because there's been things that have been said. Who was I? I think I was talking to a priest in our diocese. Anyways, and one of the things he said that I thought was really interesting, he had explained an intellectual argument that I thought hadn't really been touched on, because it came from a Catholic perspective of our rights, right? So like, it's fundamental, like the reason that it's fundamentally like, one of the main things we should focus on in terms of like the right to life or whatnot is that it's the first right in all of your rights. If you don't get that one right, if we don't get that one solidly found, like as a foundation, then we can't have any other rights after that. Because you have to have the right to live. Like that's like the first right that you should get. And he said, so all of these other ones that we can talk about, like your right to work or your right to,
just wage.
Any of those things don't matter.
Right to property.
They don't matter unless you are able to live in the first place. And so he was saying that's why he thought it was so fundamental, and why it has almost become so polarized, which I thought was interesting, because after talking to my husband about this topic, he says, I don't actually like this argument, because we're not going anywhere. It's not it's not changing hearts.
Yeah, you know what? Ken Craicraft has a book out this year called Citizens Yet Strangers, and it's about Catholic social teaching. I like it. Actually, I use his focus on four of the principles when I talk about Catholic social teaching now. But he challenges the rights language as actually foreign itself, and he thinks it's fundamentally a losing proposition because it's a liberal in the classic sense, secular liberal. And I'm not, when I say the word liberal here, I'm not talking about Democratic Party or Labor Party for English, but more about the modern project since the Enlightenment. That it's rooted in rights, and it's rooted in individual rights, and it's a sort of social contract concept.
Yes.
So we act as separate, isolated individuals, and elect to enter social society together, and we negotiate what we'll give up for that. So that so I come in with really completely autonomous rights, and then I'll negotiate with you and what I'll surrender for my own benefit. Safety, security, commerce. Okay, we got to work together, so let's negotiate. But there's no moral order to that. His argument is that when you get into rights language, invariably it pits the mother's rights against the infant's rights, and that's always an unsatisfactory negotiated settlement that will favor typically the mother, because she's ambulatory and up and around, and his argument that the tradition, that's our Catholic tradition, is more rooted in duties and obligations. So, and I think that's a language. That's a language that actually resonates ultimately. So, I thought this is brilliant, and maybe we need to get out of this rights language, because we're talking, and that's an example of modernity, a philosophy or metaphysics that's very foreign to the Catholic doctrines. Now, we use the term rights occasionally, but it's he says in air quotes a lot of the time. And John Paul will talk about the rights so-called, but that's not native to Scripture. You don't see anywhere in sacred Scripture where we talk about rights.
There's a couple things. I'm going to say three things, but we'll get to the next question. The last thing is the third question. But the first thing I wanted to say is there's a lady from Canada, and I will link her name in this part of the video.
Okay. All right.
Because I don't remember it.
Okay.
But she was on Pints with Aquinas, and she had a great argument, and she was talking about duty, right?
Yeah.
So there was the example of there's a famous violinist, and you wake up one day and you're sewed to his side, like to keep him alive, and it's only for 3 months or something like that.
Right.
Are you obligated to do it, right?
Yeah.
And she said no. But the primary difference between the violinist and the person is that when you're a parent, when it's your child, when it's your DNA, there's a responsibility that you have to your offspring. And so when we're talking about rights and obligations, I think that language that you're saying, we should pinpoint that it is important. And I think that makes the difference between a right for this violinist to live versus this obligation a parent has to for the good and well-being of their child, right?
I actually think it's also, let's say, a deeper language, maybe to go back to Narnia, the deeper magic, right? And that, because rights is so separating. It's basically what you owe me, and it leads as it's progressed. And I don't want to be totally sound like I'm just negative about the liberal project. There's been good in identifying human rights, and the church has certainly recognized that. But if it becomes the dominant metaphysics of what it means to be person, that I'm an entity of 100 rights or 1,000 rights or whatever I deem a right, because there's no transcendent, then we're talking about a metaphysics that's radically different than what we offer to the world, which is, we're social by nature. It's a rejection of our dignity as of persons, because we don't exist in isolation any more than Jesus exists in isolation from the Father. So Jesus comes to do the will of the Father out of duty and obligation, not out of, he doesn't talk about his rights over and against the Father's rights. We laugh. That seems so foreign. That sounds awful. Yeah. And yet maybe that's a way of helping us understand that the language that we're using, as much as we try to evangelize the world, we have to be careful about not so appropriating the beliefs of the world, so that we're compromised. We're locked into arguments that we can't get out of, because we've conceded the core of our revelation, or what we see as essential to what it means to be a human.
Yeah, so I believe her name is Carrie Gress. She talks about how sometimes it's not helpful to use the word feminism, right? If we're talking about these social structures, I think it's the same thing with probably any topic. It's almost like there's these socially charged words that if we engage with that language as is, then we're almost setting ourselves up for failure, because people have their set beliefs, they're locked in left brain, right?
Yeah, even though there can be an appropriate application, John Paul, again, very much about a Christian feminism, but there is a practical element where we could recover this language, but it's so complicated now. We have to step back, but in stepping back, we have to know who we are. Right. And I think my core thesis about Catholic social teaching and how and discerning the signs of the times is that every culture is integral to some belief system. There's some dominant way of seeing what is the story we tell ourselves. What's the meta narrative? And I think we live in a time that has a meta narrative. It's articulated for us by academic institutions, by the entertainment industry, by our political structures, our economics, global capitalism. All of these things form a way of telling us every day, every hour. Our machines tell us every time we look at them, that your task in life is to be you, and only you can be you. To challenge any unchosen duty, or no unchosen obligations, that you should be free. So the gender movement is a great illustration of, I didn't choose my gender, so I have a right to rebirth myself in any way I want. And so, wow, that's mind-boggling. How do we counter that? What's the language? We have to step out of something that's integral to our common culture. So I think, in my experience, addressing a profound, a belief system that's so materialistic and reductionist. There's no upstairs, right? It steamrolls us, and so I think you have to you've got to step back and rediscover what it is that you have to offer, and then come to a language. Now, Catholic social teaching is a language that can engage, but sometimes you have to challenge the dominant religion. And if we call it a religion, I think because there's a lot of faith involved in secular modernity, or even science. Science is kind of the favorite of the disciplines now. Science will answer all of our problems, really. But does it tell us what love is, or beauty, or goodness, or friendship, or justice, or dignity, or joy, or hope? Actually, science can't give you an answer to any of those things. And those are the things actually that are the most important things to us.
Yeah.
When at the end of the day, so we're putting our eggs in this basket, saying, we can use, the human sciences. These are the things that form our culture, not religion and philosophy as in the past. And you have to say, frankly, that's an impoverished religion.
In a way, it's sad. Because think about people, I forget what it's called, but they basically believe that everything around us is our synapses or whatever reacting to the material world around us.
Absolutely.
So I'm not actually having any intellectual thoughts with you based off. I'm just reacting to the wavelengths of the words coming out of your mouth whatever, and it's triggering.
It's all Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene. Attraction and marriage, having children, that's just about pushing your genetic code into the future. And you can hold that. First of all, there's no ethics in that. And if you believe that, there's no justice.
Right, because
no, there's nothing.
Nothing.
No, it's just. And do you challenge sort of the new atheism? Do you really believe that? Do you think that's true? Is that adequate? Are all poets and mystics liars? Is Teresa of Avila a liar? I mean, is the sunset that takes your breath away? Is what you're offering me adequate?
Yeah.
At some point, I think it is just a matter of faith, but I think that that's just not. It's not good enough. There's a Catholic author that I like to quote. I can't think of his name right now. My little trapped. But that was his reaction to secular humanism as being the answer to, he was a convert, and he said, "I'm sorry, that's not good enough. That won't do. Bad show. I demand something better. Love alone in God, And so you do have to kind of, but we have a better narrative. We'll out-narrate secular modernity, but we got to get our act together and know what's our story. We got a great story.
Yeah.
And Catholic social teaching is part of that story.
Well, one of the things that I was actually just talking to my sister-in-law about this weekend was we were talking about this, everyone's being diagnosed with, she's a pediatrician, and she's like, everyone's being diagnosed with ADHD, or they think they have autism, or they have all these social things. And what I told her, I said, I'm watching YouTube videos where there was one that it was like, if you sleep with your wrists curled in, then that's a sign of ADHD or something like that. And she was like, my son is a perfect example, fully diagnosed, an actual case of ADHD, and he sleeps like this.
Yeah.
And not like that at all. And so she's like, but I told her, I said, part of that is I think that these people say, oh, here are some uncommon signs of ADHD or whatever. And then you kind of have a group. You're like, oh, well, I do that. Because I do sleep like this.
We're pathologizing ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. We just become a science project.
Right. But at the same time, it's also like, oh, there's this group. And now that I have this thing that I can identify with, and it's the same thing with other things. It's not just ADHD or autism or gender dysphoria or any of this stuff. It's just, it could be science, it could be all of this stuff. Right. Once you find your group, if your identity isn't, I'm a child of God. If my worth comes from my specialness, what makes me special is I'm a child of God. Right. When we forget that, then we have to cling on to all these different groups because that makes us special. And I'm not saying
it gives us it tells us a story that it gives us a way of making sense, because life is hard. I do think there is a sense, and this is in that left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing of because we're a left hemisphere dominant culture, the rational, the scientific, the compartmentalization, the abstraction over the reality. And one of the, Miguel Christ in his book says one of the problems with our left hemisphere, and it's in all of us, and they compete with each other. There are two ways of being, is that it's super optimistic and unrealistic about its shortcomings. It's so confident that it's right. And we need to we need to reactivate the sense of wonder, mystery. What is the core meaning of repentance? Metanoia is to change your mind, be open to seeing it differently. Why is repentance, why is the Christian discipleship story a lifelong process that it always, when you think you're there, God steps back and draws you further. You can't take control, and we want that so much. We do wonderful things with our left hemisphere. We build civilization, but we're overconfident. So I think sometimes you in all of this self-assertion, or I reject anything that I didn't choose. The anthem of choice, including my body, is so dysfunctional. And it so degrades our capacity to wonder or to be in relationship. We need to kind of forget about ourselves a little bit. We need to be nothing before we can be something.
Right.
Isn't that the message of Christ? I think that's at the core. All of this is at the core of, actually, oddly Catholic social teaching, which is rooted in our social nature. We have to be no thing. I'm quoting a Catholic philosopher that you have to be no thing before you can be something. You have to give yourself away to get yourself. There's I want to read this just as this is a quote by Timothy Petitsis. He's a doctor. Actually, he's an Orthodox guy, but he talks about liturgy. And I think this is very interesting. We started about conversion and liturgy as poetry and mystery. And he says, liturgy has a component of being long and boring. It has to have a component sometimes of being long and boring. If everything, including the worship and experience of God, is just reduced to having a purpose and a function, then you remain mired in the left-brain reductionism of contemporary society. If all you're doing with your Christian faith is doubling down on the mistakes of modernity and are entrenched by the allure of utility and power, control, we just want that, right? Science will tell us the answer, whatever it is. You're just a danger to yourself and others. You need to come to something deeper, to the power of, I'm not here anymore. You become a slave to yourself. Liturgy helps us overcome this. True liturgy fosters self-forgetting. The liturgy fosters self-unknowing. You have to get out of the way of yourself. It brings us to theophany. We experience God. When you have an experience of God, you're more real than you've ever been, and you're not thinking about yourself. Those ecstatic experiences of the saints, like Teresa of Avila or of Joseph of Cupertino, where they actually levitate. They're just out-of-body experiences. So living things are constituted liturgically. I think this is brilliant insight. Our social life and our communities, when healthy and thriving, emulate liturgy. Think about how liturgy functions, the order, the reciprocity of cult, and he's suggesting that really our best social orders, it may not seem like it, but family is kind of liturgical. There is a rhythm. There's roles for people to play. And actually, as much as we grind on each other a little bit, because we need to do that, we thrive. We crave that sort of liturgical life. So I think, if Catholic social teaching really is enacted, it's sort of like it's like liturgy in a strange way.
I think, sorry, I'll let you continue in a second, but I just wanted to say, as you're talking, one of the thoughts that came to mind is just as in going to Mass and experiencing the liturgy, there's not really much that we can do. Sure, we can say, the responses and whatnot, but it's being done to us in a way, right? It's the same call to be in that moment as it is to be in your family relations. Yeah. There's and we want to be called.
Yeah.
Like we want to be called to the altar, and we
Yeah.
want to be called by our spouse to do
Yeah.
certain things,
Yeah.
even when it's hard. Like sometimes there's Sundays that you wake up and you're tired and you don't want to go.
Absolutely.
But there's still this call for you to go.
Right.
And I think, again, back to this obligation word that we used earlier.
Duty, right?
Duty and obligation.
Yeah.
It's the same. It kind of mixes in and it melds together the same thing in the family life as it does in the liturgical life.
I mean, it's like, or going to confession. I mean, there's a lot of it's like, I don't really want to do that, But
as soon as you go, you're like,
usually, usually you come out of it and you think, wow, I'm so grateful that we have this. Even if it isn't the perfect confession, or you've got that ritual that just kind of takes you through and so somehow it's like flow. Have you heard of this notion of flow? You get into flow where you're really, and I think, that's what the saints are. They flow. They're completely for the other. And I mean, in a weird way, and Bishop Barron talks about this, on the cross, Christ has perfect flow with the Father. And it's an abject picture of a debasement and pain and suffering. And yet, as he says, it's an image of a man fully alive, because he's completely emptying himself to the Father for us, So it is this, that's what I said, it's hard to institutionalize any element of discipleship because you get in the way of it. And so always that need for humility, is this right? When I would write our appeal letters, for Catholic Charities, I'd always end with a statement, please, we're praying for you, to our supporters. Please pray for us that we'll stay faithful to the mission entrusted to us. Never assume that that's always, you always have to know there's more that needs to be given, or there's more that needs to be seen, and you can't see when you're trying to hold it so much or take possession of it.
One of the questions I had, and maybe this is going a little off topic where we are now, but one of the questions I had was like, as a director of an organization, how it's interesting because you need to bring into this Catholic identity, right, to the business, but like, how do you keep that identity when your job is to, make sure payroll's going out and making sure that the temperature in the room is right, the debates over the temperature. So, you can get stuck in the small stuff. Right. Yep. But so there's that question. But then I also want to get into, since you had these different avenues for Catholic Charities, I wanted to see if you could touch and kind of give a brief overview of Catholic social teaching, or like maybe the pillars of Catholic social teaching. Okay. But first, I guess the director, how are you being able to balance those two?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me that question periodically over a 30-year career, I might answer it differently. Yeah. And it may be just what I've been thinking about or reading, but I do think there's a little left-right hemisphere element to that. So there's the practical operation. You do need to keep the heat on. You need a functional and safe work environment. You need to be sure that people have the equipment that they need to do the task that you've given them. So you have to enter into that operational mode, the managerial mode. The leader mode, though, is where you have to be strategic in how you provide the vision. And so that's where you have to describe a destination for people and invite them into that. And it's not your destination. So the great thing about being Catholic is that there's so much resource. Again, maybe almost too much. It overwhelms us. And sometimes it is a matter of, what can I say? How can I make this as simple as possible? I remember working on this about how to operationalize basic Catholic social teaching for staff. And again, particularly important, a lot of non-church goers. I said, we came down to three things. If you could just do these three things, don't worry about it. Just do these three things. Hospitality, presence, and love. Now love is a little complicated, but love in the sense of being a gift today for someone else. Mm-hmm. So in this interaction, whatever it might be, you're talking to your coworker or greeting a client, that your focus is on the personal virtue of love, which is being a gift to that person. Hospitality, do you create a sense of hospitality, of welcome? Is there a sense of being present? I'm here for you. I'm notorious for getting distracted, doing too many things, worrying about the temperature and worrying about ordering computers, and someone comes in my office. I need to think, right now I need to be present to you. In this interview, I have to be present to this conversation. Right. Those are all foundational elements of our Christian faith. The hospitality is a key feature of the public ministry of Jesus. Presence. There's that great in this story of the woman who is bathing his feet. And Peter says, "Hey, this is kind of embarrassing. She's got doesn't look this. The bad optics here." And he says to Peter, "Do you see her?" It was a call to presence. Do you see this woman? Do you see her? Someone once told me that Christianity is a religion of the face. The right hemisphere sees the whole face. The left hemisphere doesn't. And that's presence. So anyway, after working on teaching Catholic social teaching for years and years and all these principles, I said, if you, at the end of the day, do an exam. We have this thing we do an exam in the Catholic. Just at the end of the workday, do an exam. Did I create it? Did I help with today once? Did I do something that fostered hospitality? Today, was there a time when I didn't want to, but I worked to be present to somebody? Or I remembered that I hadn't been very present, and maybe did I go back to that person? And was there a time when I really concretely thought about just take the gift and sacrifice of my time as a gift? That's an action of love. So those are that, in a way, I said, if you can do this thing, don't worry about the rest of it. I mean, there's certain value principles that we'll have to talk about, certain things we can't do, certain things we need to do. These are all proactive: presence, hospitality, and love. That's a summation, really, of the gospel, right, of discipleship. But it holds the principles of Catholic social teaching.
Which, again, would reinforce the foundations of, like, what you guys are doing at Catholic Charities, or what they're doing at Catholic Charities.
Well, and maybe modeling for people the kind of life that's worth living, right? So a distressed mother or someone who's in a bad relationship, that diminishes her dignity. These issues of these principles are operative. First of all, exhibiting those principles so that someone coming in didn't feel like, well, that was a transaction. Did they really see me? Did they care about me? That was a positive experience. I want to go back there. There was something that felt different. What was that? They might not be able to articulate. I felt welcomed, or I felt like they really looked at me. I wasn't just here's a form, fill this out. And then the way they took time for me, that's different. I can't put my finger on it. You're on your way, and maybe that can carry back. We can teach them about, or find safe places for them to go, or maybe help a couple that's in a crisis in their marriage through, or someone who's clinically depressed or has great anxiety, because so many people do today. But you have to start with these foundational relational principles. So that's kind of applied Catholic social teaching. Those are universal ideas. Yeah. So you could. You do a presentation for a staff, and then would they pass the test? Probably what are the 7 or 4 or 10? But presence, hospitality, love, those are things. And sometimes we'd focus on one. Let's work on presence for a while. Just think about today, just one time, because it's infectious. I don't want to sacrifice time right now, but I'm going to deliberately, active will. That's the capacity of love, is in our will. It's not an emotion. It's an act of the will. I'm going to decide to be present to this person. And maybe, especially if it's a client that's difficult or a coworker that's difficult, but I'm going to choose to, and you know what? It can change the relationship. You see people differently.
Yeah. So. I think I don't know if everyone's experienced this, but I know that I've experienced when you take a step after being annoyed or being hurt by a person over and over again, and then just being, instead of being, and I don't like using this word, but like a victim, and being being like, oh, well, that person hurt me, so I'm going to shut them out.
Sort of focused on yourself, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
There was actually a moment in high school, there was this girl that really didn't like me.
Yeah.
And I remember in college, I ran into her. So we went to the same like community college, and I ran into her, and she was running out of her practice, and she was sobbing. Yeah. And I was just like, in that moment, and I like, never have we really talked. We never really jived. We were on the same teams for certain things, but in that moment, I finally saw her.
Right. Yeah, there you are.
And I wasn't even interacting with her. Right. All I saw was her passing, and I actually saw her for the first time. And again, we haven't really talked again since, but I ended up reaching out to her that night and said something to the effect of like, hey, I just noticed I saw you, and I just wanted to check in on you and see if you're okay. Yeah. And she said something like, yeah, I'm fine. It was, whatever. But at the same time, for me, all of the pain and suffering that she had put me in through the last 4 years of school just disappeared. They dissolved in that moment because I finally saw the person. Yeah, that's right. So there's things like that that happen in the workplace or even with clients. If you
when people come for help, they're vulnerable. It's a moment of, and in a way, this is where you can get in the way of the mission, right? You have control over benefits, so you have a lot of power. I remember a counselor once saying, I learned very skilled, effective, really one of, fabulous mental health counselor. But he said, I realized at some point I could make people cry. I had this power of potential manipulation. So you have to, because the vulnerability of another person needs to call out, that idea that everything I do has to be for your benefit, not it can't service any of my needs. So it has to be outward focused, and that's extraordinarily challenging. We're not born saints. We have to work on this. We struggle. We're going to fall. You have to get up, repent, start again. But it's in the vulnerability of the other that we find our own vulnerability.
Yeah, so. I think the other thing that is kind of sad is that in our culture today, at least in the social media land, I think a lot of the things that go viral are not necessarily what we're talking about. Like, I remember in college, I did an essay. It's like a 15-page research paper, and I did it on the effects of social media. And Twitter actually, back in 2015, 16, did a study on how many posts it would take for someone to do how many posts would they have to see to react in a positive way versus how many would you have to see, negative posts would you have to see to react in a negative way. And I can't remember exactly how many the positive, it was over 5, under 10. Yeah. I think probably we'll say 7, but I remember exactly that it was 3 negative posts and you're going to post something negative. And they did these studies on these users. It was in their guidelines at this point. So they were just auditing people and feeding them different algorithms and whatnot. And I think that's interesting in what we're talking about today, because when we were talking about this vulnerability, I was thinking to myself, how can we spread this message, but in a way where it's like an uphill battle, because when you're in pain, you like to see pain because you're like, oh, someone else is suffering, and I can oh, maybe they have it worse than me, or maybe I can, I can be in that suffering and watch that suffering of the other person and take it off myself versus allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Yeah, that's so hard.
I think it's good to know, one, recognizing it, that it's hard to do, and that we're always at work, all of us, So, Right.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the pillars. So, in Catholic social teaching, what are the main pillars, or I guess what would you say the main pillars of Catholic social teaching in the church are today?
One thing I do want to mention before I do that is that, and this is one of my cautions about maybe any presentation in the church of principles, is that it is an abstraction. And I'd say that's true of dogmatic theology, biblical scholarship, of ecclesiology, moral theology, anything. So always be aware that just listing, things it's a limiting kind of way of doing it, and that our understanding of prayer and theology and dogmatics, these all are interconnected. So you can't. I love Catholic social teaching. I don't like ecclesiology, or I don't like dogmatics. It's like it doesn't. The faith doesn't really work like that.
Yeah.
It's really integrated. I mean, the Catholic it's whole. There's a holistic, and there's always limitations in each of these disciplines, and there's limitations in what we can say about Catholic social teaching. So
yeah, I guess the reason that I want to preface this, and I'm glad that you said that, but the reason why is sometimes it can feel so, again, and maybe this is us just being left brain, like trying to just describe it away or whatever. Yeah. But sometimes it feels so abstract that there's like, oh, well, I kind of know that this fits in that, and I kind of know that that fits in there.
Right.
But I don't know if there's social teachings that I'm missing or like that kind of stuff. So I guess if there's like just like an overarching like
well, I say all those things and then I do it. I do list it, So, but it's always to remember one. Because we do function in a left brain way too, and sometimes you need a structure to hold things and think about them. So it's just that the structure itself is not the thing, right?
Yeah.
So
and the fluidity of it, right? Because there could be like healthcare concerns that have to do with immigration or with,
in terms of particular topical areas, absolutely.
Right. So there's interconnection even in between all of the social teachings together, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So, and this is actually in the Ken Craicraft book I mentioned, Citizens Yet Strangers. I liked what he did. He reduces this to four principles. And the four principles are the dignity of the person, the solidarity of humankind, the subsidiary nature of who we are in our social life, and then the common good. I always privilege, if you will, shorter over longer lists. And over time we were 7, and then we got to 10, But I thought from these 4 core, you can work out to just about any element of church teaching. So obviously the question of human dignity, we just had a papal instruction on this, Dignitatis Infantata, came out in March of this year. But the notion that we have a dignity that the church describes as infinite or uncompromisable. So, and it has to do with this notion that we're made, and this is obviously a deeply biblical principle, but that we're made in God's image, so that there's an inherent something important as a person, because we're the human beings are the only persons in creation. I'm not sure about angels, if they're persons or not, but certainly human beings. So, so this is related to, and it can't, our dignity isn't, it's not attribute based. You're really smart, you're really good looking, you're really healthy, you're a great athlete. It eludes attributes, and we're a very attribute-based culture. Yeah. And this is what leads into euthanasia and abortion and things like this, that we work in what are your values to society and things like that. Now the trick in this dignity thing is that we're not always behaving in a way that's consistent with that. Right. So so that's something we have to remember, and that's part of the process of growing in faith and repentance. So
I think Father Dom at Our Lady of Ephesus, his metaphysics class, kind of, I'm not saying I have any idea about that, because it's pretty over my head. Yeah. But I will say it opens the door just a little bit to that first topic. Yeah,
that's right. Well, and there's 2 implications to dignity as we understand it in the tradition. One is a sense that we're self-aware. We know ourselves as we have existential awareness. So that's really a marker of transcendence. And it also leads to something that's very, very important that related to our self-awareness is that we're subjective. The church is very keen on valuing each individual. Even to use a language from the modern world, our identity as we understand it. That the church is not against identity. And every person is unique. So this is a component of our dignity. And it's important to hold that principle, that element, that implication. The other implication is because we have self-awareness, we're capable of reflection, judgment, and action. That means we're moral agents. So saying that you have human dignity is a nice thing, but it brings with it some important implications. All right. So that's the first principle.
Obligation and duty.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe?
As opposed to rights. Yes, the church really is much more in its groove, in flow, what we believe when it talks about moral agency rather than right. So the next two are really this two sides of one coin. Let's say that. First is human solidarity. And this is where I would think that we really are speaking a language that's very foreign to the American tradition, which is rooted in the social contract tradition, rooted in sort of the notion,
the American
political,
okay.
Which is that kind of a notion of a social contract that
right.
we elect. We're not social by nature, but we elect to enter into social society. So the Catholic tradition sees human solidarity as rooted, and it follows from the image of God notion that the image of God is the divine mystery is social, and it manifests by revelation as three persons. We know that in faith. That's given to us. So this is, as we're made in that social nature, this is the basis of our capacity for empathy and compassion. And to deny our social nature is a grave violation of our dignity. So our alienation from each other that we all experience at different times is not natural for us. And, as opposed to other different Christian traditions, the Catholic Church's teaching on the fall does not obliterate this natural social nature. You might, and I'm hesitant to try to articulate other Christian religious traditions, but you'll see in some forms of Protestantism, total depravity, so that we're completely fallen, that there's no social orientation left because the fall so obliterates that. So this is actually that we hold on to that we're still capacitated. We're not completely destroyed in the sense of the fall, and we're totally in boxes away from each other. We're not. That would drop us into the secular liberal order of the Hobbesian state of nature. If you ever read, the life of every person is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
Horrible world.
Yeah.
No, we don't see life like that, and that Christ does redeem. He's the embodiment of the restoration of solidarity between God and man, and between each other. So he overcomes sin, even our denial of human solidarity. When we do deny it, that's a sin, and Christ overcomes that. So, and so that's the one side of this coin. The other side is this kind of complicated issue of subsidiarity, but it is the sort of mirror virtue of solidarity, and subsidiarity is the principle that our social life should be cultivated at its smallest, closest, and least complex order or setting. So solidarity affirms is an image of God that we're social by nature. I mean, we rock, we flow together, and we're really miserable when we're isolated. That's a very good description of modern culture because it boxes us into our ourselves. Be yourself, and that's why we're having all these problems. Mm-hmm. So we're social by nature. So how do we foster a good social life? And this really is at the root of the Church's teaching on subsidiarity. So subsidiarity are the conditions where we enact our being in solidarity with others, where they're best fostered. So Christianity is, to live a Christian life is not just an idea. It's not just I accept Jesus in my heart and I'm done. Mm-hmm. It's you have to embody it. This is very Catholic. So it has to be lived out. We take James seriously, and and all of the teachings that are so recurrent about what it means to live in God's life is you have to pursue a life of virtue, which is virtue is essentially associated with a social engagement. So the end of subsidiarity is the flourishing of our common life, and also it's the environments that foster this idea of moral agency. So it creates the environment where we're most capacitated to be dignified. And a key element of dignity, I didn't mention this earlier, but I may have mentioned it at some point, but it's freedom. So the Catholic Church is a big champion of freedom. Well, Christianity. So freedom is essential. Free will, right? So Joseph Ratzinger, before he was Pope, described, I think it was in his book Introduction to Christianity, he said that Christianity could be described as a philosophy of freedom. So we're big on freedom. So you see odd little parallels with the modern world that says we're all about freedom. Catholic Church says we're down with that. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? We're all about everybody being, the individual subjectivity. The Catholic Church, that's right. That's also. But radically different conclusions of what those implications of that are. So this issue of agency is the capacity to make moral actions. So we want the best society, and it's rooted in small scale, and subsidiarity, the root of subsidiary is subsidium from the Latin, which means to enact. We actually are given the freedom by God to enact ourselves, to our own subsistence. That's an extraordinary assertion. It makes Christianity very different than other religions like Islam, where we live under a rule of God's will, arbitrary will. So God condescends so much that in creation, he populates creation with persons. You and me are in that category. That's an image of God. And that we're given the freedom to enact, to subsist ourselves. That's the idea that we have to be no thing to be something, right? So you have to get out of the way of yourself to be yourself. It's a very sign of contradiction. It's a paradox. But that giving yourself away is where you engage in agency. This is duty and responsibilities. It's outward focused. It's not what's entitled to me. My life is you. I have to be ordered to you. So moral agency, we have to have freedom to commit moral actions, and we want to make our freedom and moral actions as broad as possible. So we want to foster a culture that makes us as morally accountable as possible, because that's our dignity, that's our destiny. Now, this is important in an organization like Catholic Charities. The last thing that we want to do when we help people is create a dependency that diminishes them, right? Yeah. That undermines their freedom and their capacity to take on the moral life that's part of their dignity. So it's about assisting and accompanying, to use Pope Francis' language, toward fulfillment of human dignity. And that's best done in settings that are intimate. The primary subsidiary of society is the family. The family is a society where, when we think about it, you learn most about your moral agency. You learn, the family life should be modeled on a life of virtue, of true community, a true community of persons, and our parents. As a parent, you're fostering and drawing your kids along. You're raising them into their dignity, to exercise their God-given freedom. You don't want to dominate them so that they're dependent on you. Fostering their freedom to live as moral agents, which is to be virtuous. So subsidiary is one of those really complicated things, but I love the phrase "small is beautiful." It was a book written in the early 70s about the environmental movement then. But it's a profoundly wise thing. Now, it's not always the smallest that fosters subsistence. But, sometimes you need larger structures. But principally, it's where relationships are meaningful. So family, neighborhood, community, social associations, parish. Parishes are an extremely important environment for subsidium, where we learn and foster and act out liturgically. You can see how that Dr. Padis's notion of community, family being liturgical, it's a fostering of other-centeredness, right? So subsidiary is it's the secret sauce in Catholic social teaching, and it gets overlooked. But I give Ken Craicraft credit for this insight, that it's the environment that nurtures moral agency, and true freedom. And, we hear things about, unjust structures, right? Well, there's truth in that. You want structures that foster human dignity. And that's the idea here, I think, from the church's perspective. The insight is that it's best when it's scaled to the person.
Yeah.
So we don't get too big. Globalization's a train wreck for human dignity because we're not dealing with each other. We don't see each other, So, and the family is the prototype. So
I have a couple of things in my head that I'd like to talk about with those 4 in mind.
Well, there's one more I haven't talked about.
Oh, okay.
Which is it's the common good.
Okay.
And I would say that there's lots of ways. It's the environment. The social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individually, to reach their fulfillment. Really, it's where you have the right balance of solidarity and subsidiarity, where those are best and most fully enacted. Is what we call the goods. The common good.
Okay, and I think that goes into my question.
Okay.
So my main thing that I'm thinking about is in our current structure of society in the United States, we have like Catholic social teaching, and then we have like our political teaching.
Sure.
So like we're trying to blend these two,
Yeah.
and like when it comes to topics about, and I mean, this was probably not talked about much this election, but like a universal healthcare system, like how can we make decisions on those kinds of things? Because there's this part of us where it's like, well, we shouldn't be forced to pay for other people's things, but at the same time, we need to be like, we also need to be looking out for the common good, right? So there's just, I guess, when it comes to politics, there's a lot of questions of how to vote your conscience and vote with what Catholic social teaching has. That's not just necessarily abortion or other things. Like, so I guess when we're talking about this, I think healthcare is the one I'm thinking right now.
That's a great issue.
Or even like, I think that's the simplest question. So like when we're talking about healthcare, like universal healthcare, how does that fit into Catholic social teaching? How should we start to, what questions should we ask ourselves? Again, because I'm not asking you to say like, oh, what should we vote on? But I'm just saying like, what questions should we ask ourselves?
I would decline to answer that question.
But like
under advice of counsel, I'm not going to answer that question.
Right. But I guess what questions do we need to start asking ourselves that like would lead us to the path that the church would want us to take when we're thinking of those of these teachings?
That's great. Well, that's a great question. One thing I would say just initially, the church certainly is not libertarian in its view.
Right.
So the church sees obviously governments have a job. The government has a job to do, and the church's job is to ask the government to do its job. Now what it has to do is to foster the things that we talked about. So I'd say that our faith has an intrinsically political dimension to it, but it can't be identified with any specific political party. And we don't have a model of politics necessarily, but we're willing to be critical of all models. I'm being evasive for a reason. And we're essentially political because we're essentially social. So that raises the question of how we structure our governing charters. But that's not the end of we're not exclusively only political. We're more than that. The church and the government have distinct roles, but they are interrelated at times. We have a duty to obey the laws of our country, but we don't obey those laws only on their own terms. Just because they're the law doesn't mean they're just. And we may be obligated to disobey the laws if they violate human dignity or some principle.
What is it? Thomas Aquinas, doesn't he say like an unjust law?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Like you can ignore basically or choose
or you
disobey.
may, like Thomas More, you may end up going to the,
I love Thomas More. Sorry, it's a great movie.
We have a duty to be loyal to our homeland. We're embodied persons. We have bodies. We're in a land, but that loyalty is subordinated to our discipleship. So it's not 100. There's a tension there. We have a mandate to participate in political life, but that mandate may require abstaining from political activity. Or candidate, you're not mandated to vote for any. You don't have to vote for a candidate if there's no a candidate that's acceptable. Christian life is 11 of the political order. or political life, but we're always subversive, if any. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of the interview that there's a subversive element to Christianity. We have to be intentionally dissatisfied in an ultimate sense with any, because we're in a fallen order. Even we are a bit romantic about Christendom, right?
Oh yeah.
And I'm a romantic by nature, so I can get into and this is the notion of Catholic integralism, that you can create a Catholic state. But even when we've done that, it doesn't work. We're always going to miss something. Because we get in our own way. We're sinners.
Yeah.
We're fallen. So we're always capable of allowing the four false gods of Aquinas, power, honor, wealth, pleasure, to become the gods that we worship. Yeah. And this is the Christians speaking, and we want to run things, and yet we know we've got these false gods. Our own teaching tells us, beware. There's that beautiful in the ancient liturgy of the consecration of the Pope, where the deacon stands before the new Pope, and he holds up the rope, and they light it on fire, and he says, Holy Father, sic transit gloria mundi, so passes the glory of this world. Don't get too caught up in the panoply here, So these are broad ideas. I haven't answered a specific question, but I think you go back to whatever particular issue. Healthcare is a fascinating issue as it relates to, let's say the family. If we say that the family is the primary subsidiary culture, then the government policy should be pro-family.
So, and I guess this is kind of what I'm thinking. So I was thinking about, I'll just give you, one of the things you said earlier was we can't get in our own way, or like policies can't get in the way of human freedom. And so this is what I'm going to say. Well, human freedom is ordered, but human freedom, that's in the Christian tradition. Human freedom isn't ordered to the will of the person. It's ordered to the common good. Right.
So it has to. So we're given a capacity, but we're also, Christ reveals man to himself, right? So he gives us the form. He's the unity of the multiplicity, right? That's the language from the Church Fathers. So that we aren't just in a liberal secular sense running around as autonomous beings that have, trying to find each other and maybe build something or not, if it suits us. We have freedom. And we are unique, and there's a form to what our life together looks like. It's called the Trinity. Revelation is you're made like this. What is the Father's relationship to the Son? It's kenotic. It's in self-emptying of self to self. So form your freedom in this, and you'll be who you are. Live up to who you are. Right. So our freedom, our policies should reflect, our social nature. It should privilege family, to privilege marriage. That would be really radical. It didn't used to be radical,
right,
to encourage people to get married. In fact, we had laws against doing things before marriage. No, I'm not saying we reenact all of those kinds of laws, but you certainly bias. Marriage is, commitment is important. Stable families are important.
Well, let me give you the example I was going to use, and I think I definitely misquoted you earlier with what I was trying to say, but I guess I'll give you the example and then we can kind of go from there. So the government offers these different benefits for people when they need help, right? And so one of the ones that I'm familiar with, for a period of time, my husband and I were in section 49, 42, I always get those mixed up, housing, which basically wasn't section 8, which is where the government subsidizes your housing.
Okay,
It's the housing in between, which is like, okay, so you make under a certain amount of money, but over a certain amount. And so you're in this like little window, and there is enough housing, like we deem this housing in high markets, this is set aside for you.
Yeah.
And if you qualify, there's usually a long list, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah. Right. And so we qualified and got into that. And this was when we had my first son. Yeah. And I decided I wanted to stay at home because at the time it didn't really make sense to go back to work because I would be netting like $200 after childcare and whatever. And I was like, that doesn't really make sense. So we decided to take advantage of this program. Yeah. But I also started to try to work a little bit. So I was doing some contract work. And what I realized is this is a game. And so the system that we have right now, like there's this beauty in that it does provide help for people that need it. Right. But then there's also this game where, like, I think in my mind, with my limited knowledge of how this actually works, a sliding scale would be more appropriate. So like, for example, in the program we were in, if you made over the certain amount, they would give you a certain period of time, which was generous. It was like 6-8 months or whatever, to find a new place to live. But it was also jumping from something that was fairly reduced to market value. And so in my head, I was thinking, you know what would be better? Instead of me like feeling like, oh, I can't work that many hours this week because if I do, then our total income will be over this, and then we'll have to be forced to move, and we have a less than a 1-year-old, and you know, like there's all this stress of like trying to do that. We decided like, okay, but luckily, very luckily, the apartments that we were in, they were like, oh, we're not going to re-up this. Our 20 years is up of doing this program. We're not going to re-up.
They've discovered, they're going market rate is what they call it.
Right, but they also did a reduced market rate so that you're not like gouged into it or whatever. They had like a sliding scale, so every 6 months you would get an increase in your rent until you got up to market value, which was very generous, right? And I think that's the right way to do it. But in that time period, it was very clear to me, the system that we have, although it's very helpful, and I think that it's good. Same thing with like the WIC program and all these other goods that we have in society. They're really actually good programs, but they're so limited in a way. Like there's not enough flexibility or like sliding scaleness of the program that it makes it so that people are, and then this is where you come into like politics, that people are against these things because people play the game or misuse the system or whatever. So when I'm thinking about this in like Catholic social teaching, I'm thinking of the family. I'm thinking of my example with our family. It's like we had this program, which is good. But then we're also limited or like not forced, but there's a incentive to be trapped where we're not going to our potential because there's this uncertainty that looms around it.
Something that may limit your it may create dependencies. Limiting your capacity, your freedom, your moral agency, if you will. And
So this is kind of where my brain was going while you were talking.
It's a great place to go. So you're wrestling with the complexities of living in we're in a highly technologically advanced society, extraordinarily heavy, large bureaucracies, systems programs with good intention that do some good things, and that other things that seem to work counter to Catholic social teaching principles.
And so it's like, it's beautiful in a way because it's like really hitting the point of Catholic social teaching, but at the same time, it's also really limiting people and causing harm.
It's hitting Catholic social teaching and undermining it too.
At the same time.
So that's that's a reality of a tension that it's good that we have, so hold that tension. Because you work to, how can we make this program, what would be a better program? Or is it too large? Would it be better to localize it more and give local control? Or to the caseworkers, to give them more flexibility in working with these guiding principles? I don't have an answer to your question except to affirm the struggle, because I think that's exactly it. And the temptation is always, let's get
away with it,
do away with all of it.
Rework with it or whatever.
So I think your tension is good. I mean, Christianity is a religion of tensions, and we have to live with that. Even just the idea of like mercy and inclusion and universality. We're the welcoming church; everybody gets in. And there's a tension between those principles and justice, rigor, conversion, repentance. Well, and you think, well, is it repentance? Is everybody welcome, or do you have to repent? And it's like, both and. And live the tension. You have to live that tension. And it's not resolvable. And I think in some ways, even as we try to operationalize on the social order our beliefs, we're not going to. It's hard to affect something that's perfect. So you can see the extremes where that's not right. No healthcare for people. That's not right. Things that undermine marriage and family. No, wow, that's profoundly disordered. That will have serious social repercussions. And we've seen that. So, but in the messy middle in struggling, but you have the challenge of the tradition. There's a movement now I see among even more conservative politicians in this country to make birth free.
Yes,
now
please.
That would not be something that I think J.D. Vance has talked about. A movement like that. He's a Republican. Historically, Republicans wouldn't be in favor of a government initiative, and yet the principle of why is the issue of a pregnant woman, what the environment, of decision making.
Why should you go into debt for having a baby?
No, yeah, exactly. I mean, because this is something. So that's just an example of where the government moves in to do something. So now you could pick an issue like how do you, you can't probably make it illegal to live together without marriage or something like we did.
Sure.
But you could incentivize in other ways. The commitment's important. That it isn't just whatever you want to do, and it's your choice. Well, that's not consistent with our tradition, because there's duties and obligations to the children that you create together.
Yeah.
So we are kind of in a time when the political structures and they are evolving rapidly right now. It's kind of interesting to see where this might come out. But
yeah, and I think the thing that I find the most interesting is it seems like everyone I think understands that there are social goods, and it'll be like, well, okay. I guess what the point I was actually going to think is, one of the things I talk to my husband and my mom about a lot is I'm kind of excited for, this is getting a little more political, but I'm kind of excited for the possibility of having RFK.
Oh, right. Yeah, Robert Kennedy. Right.
Yeah. Junior. I think that he is interesting because, we always hear about, Catholic social teaching, I think, is so countercultural that, like, sometimes we think of, like, should there not be regulations on the market? Should there be regulations? Like, because I feel like that still falls into, like, Catholic social teaching.
Sure.
And one
absolutely.
of the things that I'm kind of excited about is sometimes on the Republican Party, it's all like open market, free market, like all the time. Capitalism is a high. And maybe that's just an archetype or something. That,
kind of a neoconservative view.
Sure, right. It might be. But what I'm excited about for him is the FDA needs to ban some of these substances. Like there's things that have been banned for decades in Europe and like in Australia. And all
corporate. They call it corporate capture and complexes of profit. Now RFK is also off the charts off the issue of life issues and whatnot. He's not. Other
things.
But
at least in the food thing, I think that's
I
think that's interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's totally and I would think those are interests that are in service to the common good for sure.
But let's go back to this question. Okay, so we as Catholics, we obviously can't function in society in a bubble. So it's like, when we're talking about all of these things, what kind of frame of mind, like what kind of examine should we do on ourselves when approaching these issues, right? Because again, like it can start as something so simple as like a family getting into a program, right? That, using my example earlier, right? A family, like we're focusing on the family and we're trying to do the best for our children and hit the obligations for our children. And we're going to use a program, but that program now is in our life. So like obviously government and our family are not separated.
No, and we have to live in an imperfect world. So how you navigate the imperfections and what's good enough or something that looks like it's working, and then we realize that it's undermining, and so you always have to be alert. That's the subversive element of the Christian faith. We're liking this, but now maybe I'm not so liking this. I'm seeing things now that we didn't anticipate. Good intentions aren't, So I actually have an examine and it's just a list of questions that I've used sometimes when I do presentations about how we relate to the culture. And I sometimes stay away from the word politics because that's a trigger word we talked about. But let's just talk about the culture we live in. You know? So and you could ask yourself some of these questions personally, because I do think ultimately as a disciple, you have to start with yourself, your own examine. So in the basis of these 4 principles that we've talked about, do I radically affirm the human dignity of everyone I encounter? Boy, that's a challenge, really, when you think about it. Do I respect and cultivate an awareness of human transcendence and the meaning of a transcendent natural order? Do I see creation as itself the real presence of God? Does creation as a miracle?
Yeah.
Or the sense of my fellow. Sometimes we go to church and we'll be annoyed about, the choir's not singing very well, or that person, and the grinding. Do you stop and think, I have a consubstantial life with these people? Do I see their transcendence? Liturgy is a perfect place for it because we're right in the context, and even then we can get, But can you carry that into Fred Meyer? Just think about walking through Fred Meyer and looking at the miracle of every person. Just practice that.
Okay, so this is really funny. I used to work in Nampa, and I would drive from Boise to Nampa, and I had this dawn on me one day, and I've asked a couple people about this, but I was like, have you ever had that moment when you're driving, you look over in the car next to you, and you think, that person has a complete, they're having a complete moment, their life, everything that I experienced, they're having one of those for themselves. And it's kind of weird because, when you're driving in a car, you're like, oh, they're all cars. You're not actually thinking about the person. Well, and you're so
buffered by this machine.
Right. Yeah. And so anyways, I had this thought.
I think that's an epiphany of human solidarity, because it activates empathy and compassion. At the end of the day, they're probably struggling like I am. They have worries. I don't know what they are, but I know what worry is. Yeah. That's actually beautiful.
Well, I also want to say that's not necessarily always what I think, because then there's the people that are driving the car super dangerisely and weaving in and out. And I'm don't you know that there's other people with children on the road?
When I go to confession, it's always driving anger. I have driving anger. Do we affirm and value the uniqueness of every person? Because people look different a lot today. Sometimes you have to suspend judgment and just appreciate the people you see. Do we affirm as it relates to and is consistent with their likeness to God, each person's self-awareness and expression? So this idea of self-identity politics and whatnot, well, we know that we're ordered to certain things, but we also have to respect that there's legitimate areas of expression. Or can we accept that? Though all women don't need to look a certain way, and all men don't need to look a certain way, even though we believe that there are men and there are women, and you can't, do we recognize, help form, and support the moral agency of the people we live with? Is that important? That's really important, that you actually have moral agency.
So, okay, go into that question a little bit more. How would you rephrase that?
Well, I think it goes back to fostering it. Certainly from a parent's perspective, but I suppose it could be true in a community, in a neighborhood, that recognizing that people are, you don't want to do anything that impedes their own responsibility to be accountable for themselves. So you don't want to, and this could have implications in a political measure or something, that it would disable somebody. Would just doing for somebody isn't necessarily affirming their moral agency, or not, or it's demeaning to say, well, they couldn't help themselves, or I think that's something I'd have to think about it. I think the church is posing the question for us to go back and think about that. Okay. That's something you have to think about, right? But related to that is, do we hold ourselves accountable for our actions as a moral agent? Are we good at that? Because it's easy, even when you go to confession, I have to confess these things. But there's a lot of there's another side to this story. I'm sure the priests hear this let's stay on you for a moment. Do we express human solidarity with those we accompany and share community with through acts of presence, hospitality, and love? I talked about that. Those are, just do that and you'll get to heaven, right? Yeah. Do we exhibit a preferential love for those whose dignity is denied? We haven't used the language. I haven't talked about preferential love or preferential option. That's in the tradition, but it's rooted in the 4 principles that we discussed.
Would that be similar to start with your spouse and your children and your family and grow out? Is that what it means by preferential love?
Well, there's certainly, that's an element of it. Usually in the church's tradition, it's the church has a special interest of affirming dignity with populations that seem to be denied it. So we go out of our way to to be discriminatory about how we, those people are treated badly, or racism, for example, so that we make a point of saying, no, we have a special duty of obligation of solidarity with people who are being treated in a way that's not dignified.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, do we practice subsidiarity by encouraging, supporting, and facilitating the development of the family? Are we pro-family as the natural, first, and primary community that serves and advances human dignity and moral agency? So I don't think you can have a fair conversation about Catholic social teaching without really addressing the centrality of the natural family. I mean, I just think that's core Catholic teaching. Do we further practice subsidiarity by affirming all religious, civic, community, social, and voluntary institutions and associations, especially those nearest in scale to each of us in our local community, that foster human dignity, proper moral development, and the common good? So these social groups that are in our community, they're good. We should be a part of those things. Even in the church, the Knights of Columbus, or others. There's other social groups in the community that, when I was growing up, they were very common in America. Maybe not so much now. It's more my age and other. We're aging out of these things, but they're really good. In these local community things, that it's good to do that and support that. Yeah. That's good Catholic social teaching. Do we apply the principles of the common good in our policies, social institutions, workplaces, and community associations? Think about your workplace here at the radio station, where, do we practice the common good all the time? Good subsidiarity, good solidarity. Do we show dignity, presence, hospitality, and love? Finally, do we recognize, affirm, and support the social moral teachings of the Catholic Church as true norms for the proper expression of human freedom and the fulfillment of human dignity, ordered toward the aim of life, which is union with God in love and love of neighbor?
These are questions that I think change your life.
Yeah, I like our faith. Yeah. So again, going back to that Charles P. notion, Catholic social teaching is just one portal that can draw you in. It's a good one because it roots you in the environment, the political questions, the neighborhood association, the family. These are all social environments where the faith isn't just a devotional practice, it's enacted. And it's in the enacting that we become, we go beyond just the attributes into the reality of the persons that we spend our temporal life with, because that's how we enter our eternal life.
I think this is I think focusing on these questions, it honestly makes me feel that even though I've been trying to be intentional about being a Catholic, living a Catholic faith,
right,
that it shows me how political I am, though, because most of the time when I'm thinking about these questions, my mind comes up to how is that coming into a political reality,
right?
Which in a way, it's what it's done, I guess, in this moment is show me, wow, I really need to spend time with these, and I need to actually start to work on living these out, asking these questions for myself and then living them out. Right. And then really it does show me that I feel like I've let politics into my life way more than I need to, or that I should, right?
I think that's a function of the dominant secular religion that we're living in. Because it doesn't have a transcendent reality. So all that's real is power and politics. So we're bathed in this, in entertainment industry, in the political discourse that we experience, in the academic institutions. This is all they emphasize. So in one sense, it's natural that because we are affected by the dominant culture. So it's something in spirit of repentance, we have to recognize this is foreign to what my faith teaches me. Yeah. And I have to repent of it. But we're all, what you just said is a reality we're all living in. And if you get on social media, you'll find. Oh, absolutely. But I think the sort of advocates for, let's say, the dominant secular religion, they would say there's nothing transcendent, and it is all power and politics. That's all there is. And to be consequential, you have to be only, you're just a political animal. And we have a better narrative. That's a narrative. That's a meta-narrative. That's a metaphysical observation. I'm just saying, poor show. We have a better narrative. We have a better way we have a better story to tell you.
Okay, but we might have a better story. But my next question would be, is like, in trying to live that out, do you feel like when you were working in this realm that you felt like you had to play the game to get to live that out? I don't know. It seems so, I don't know. I guess it goes back to the...
Well, this is really the power of conversion. So it ultimately comes down to we need God. So you have to, it's Paul says, I can't do the good I want to do.
Yeah.
And God says, right, Saul, so you're now Paul. You need to change. So it always has to be your own conversion. Yeah. And that's why I'm saying ultimately you can't institutionalize this. You keep slipping back. Yeah, right. I don't do the good I want to do. And it's like, you know what? The only way you can do this is to be transformed. Yeah. And that's life in God. That's the whole point. That's the project. Yeah. That's the story. And, people who don't believe Christianity, I think Friedrich Nietzsche's a good example. He saw the power of Christianity because he didn't believe. He wasn't a believer. He didn't believe in what he would call ontological transformation, which is the change that you can be transformed in your being. But that's what we believe. Ultimately, that's the good news, that you can be renewed, the renewal in faith and baptism in the church, the sacrament, and then that's an ongoing project. Yeah. So you have to start there.
All right. Just to wrap up at this point, we've covered so much.
We have covered a lot.
We have covered a lot. And I love that it came back to the thing that we started with, was just transformation, and almost like, again, at the beginning of your story about how you were not religious, and then you had this transformation.
You need a Narnia moment.
Yeah, you need a Narnia.
Yeah, right.
Speaking of C.S. Lewis, I've said this before on my podcast, but The Great Divorce, I think, is a fantastic book of human nature. Yeah, and it's actually
Lewis is really good at all of this.
He's so good.
Yeah.
I like allegory.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the poetry. That's liturgy. Moves allegorically and symbolically. The symbolic world's always more powerful than straight narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if someone is trying to, I would love to get a list of those questions from you, and I'll link them in the description so people can look at them. Okay. I think that's a great idea.
As soon as I get my modem fixed,
that'd be great. Yeah. Then the other question is, do you think there's any books or anything that you might recommend, or any words of advice to anyone trying to live their life more faithfully to the church's teaching?
Well, this maybe is a little more political, but I did mention the Ken Craicraft book that came out this year, Citizens Yet Strangers. Okay. And he was very helpful to me in terms of framing, condensing the principles to those four that we discussed, to challenging, and he's very balanced politically. I mean, he will make everybody unhappy, and I always feel like is everybody unhappy? If you get the church's teaching right, and you're speaking to an audience, have I made everybody unhappy? Because if I have, I probably got this right. Yay! Because Christ, it's always a sign of contradiction. Yeah. But I think Citizens Yet Strangers is a nice and contemporary. He's writing in 2024. He knows the state of America. He knows the political discourse. So he's writing to that, and he's critical, just on that scale of the debate and the deficiencies that we're seeing, what our tradition would teach us.
Is he Catholic?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, he teaches at a seminary.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So, yeah. Beyond that, I'd have to think about that. I might send you some ideas, but...
yeah, we can always link them in the description as well.
Yes, right. Yeah, let me get that a little... I mean, I have a lot of other things I've alluded to, but they're probably maybe a little more abstract and not as direct and practical. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I so greatly appreciate you
Sure.
coming on. I've been looking forward to this podcast for a while, just because 2024 is an election year. I think a lot of the times, again, I'm trying to live my life a little more intentionally Catholic.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And so this has been on the forefront of my mind, but I didn't know where to start. It's kind of like the thing with technology where we have so much information. It's like hard to where do I even start to go?
Right.
You know?
Well, and the trouble with technology and the virtual world is that it is essentially a machine. It's essentially non-relational.
Yeah.
It's the worst for us, really, in all of the core things in all of those dignity issues and solidarity. And it can help us with solidarity, but sometimes I think it undermines it too much.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly it isn't scaled. I mean, technology is not a scale at all. It's not even real in a sense. So, we're pretty divided, 50-50 in the country. And we have to, that says there's a deeper conversion. Put not your trust in princes and sons of men, it says in the scripture. And ultimately, we have to have a political structure. Governments are necessary. Church is certainly not anarchist in its perspective, but it has a duty to perform. But for us to be leaven, we have to be converted.
Yeah.
And then we have to be converted again and again and keep at it.
All
Repent,
lifelong.
repent, stay in the church and repent. And, but you can, I think the Catholic social teaching tradition is a great, like I say, a window into life in God, and can be a great resource for us.
Well, and again, it's when we're not only repenting, but it's the repenting in a reformed way where we live out what we're repenting with. So I think this is a good model.
Repentance is not about, this is such a life-giving thing, because it's you in learning to give yourself away, you get yourself back, against the paradox. But every poet and mystic, even not Catholic, you see this perennial wisdom that comes through. We're so reductionist. We're so off course, in the dominant way we're living. So, get back to the magic. Find the deeper magic. Find Aslan.
Go into the Christian dream.
Go into the wardrobe. Get lost in the wardrobe. And I think then, oddly, to lose yourself, you find yourself. We need to self-forgetting a little bit. And that's where in discovering another, you find the social teachings of the church.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. It's a pleasure to
really
be here.
appreciate
I love I made a note of, I assume that your Desert Wanderers, is that your name of your?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is I love that. I thought, well, we're wanderers in the vineyard of the Lord.
That's what I was going for. I wanted to pull from the wandering in the desert of Moses, but also to get to heaven, we're all just out here wandering.
We are.
But we're also in the high desert, so it's we're desert wanderers.
Oh, well, that's true. We're right here in Boise. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, I like that a lot. So
thanks.
Yeah. All right. God bless you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Desert Wanderers. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up as well as subscribe down below. We're produced by Salt and Light Radio, so you can find us on social platforms at Salt and Light Radio or Desert Wanderers Podcast. We produce episodes every week and we launch them for you on Wednesdays. So make sure to tune in for next week's episode, and we'll see you then.